Part 1. Absence of Light. Chapter 1. As Nicole Hadden woke up, she felt at peace. It was a new day. The thoughts of the day had not yet crept into her adolescent mind. She slowly turned her head to the right and realized the time was 6:58. She came to realization that she had 2 minutes to get ready for school. Her mind raced as she got out of bed. Suddenly, she stopped and remembered something very important. She had an ace up her sleeve that no other teenage girl in the world had. She smiled and stood in place. She began to glow, and suddenly the sounds outside her window stopped, and everything was still. A bright light emanated from her body. She walked around her room, looking for her body wash. She finally found it after a while. She made her way into her bathroom and picked up a bucket filled with water in her shower. She dipped her towel in the water and started to bathe herself. After she was done, she made her way back to the bedroom where she got dressed and got ready for school. She brushed her teeth and picked up her bag with her eyes still glowing. She looked at the clock and it was still 6:59. She then walked out of her room and headed to the kitchen where she found an egg sandwich on the counter with a cup of coffee. She sat down and ate both items as she scrolled on her phone. Once she was finished, she picked up her bag and walked towards the door. An elderly white lady was standing still in front of the door. Nicole smiled as she looked at this woman. This was her grandmother, Elaine Hadden. Elaine was a red-haired woman who still glowed with youth. Nicole kissed her grandmother on the cheek and walked out the door. As she made her way to school, she enjoyed the fresh air and quietness of the outside. Everything and everyone stood still. She took one look at her watch on her wrist, and the time was still 6:59. Nicole walked until she reached her high school. There were hundreds of students who were still, and not a noise came from them. Nicole slowly walked down the halls, examining every student she passed. She finally made it to her first class, which was biology. She walked into the classroom and stood at the door. She took a few seconds to observe all her classmates. Some were rushing to their seats, while some were sitting on the desks and chatting. She also saw her only friend, Maggie Gold, checking her watch in the corner. Nicole smiled to herself and closed her eyes. Suddenly, everyone started moving in real time. She looked around the class. Maggie called for her friend. Nicole smiled and walked towards her. Chapter 2. Iconic City was known as the City of Tomorrow, a city filled with busy people and was hailed as the most technologically advanced city in the country. It was home to the biggest history museum in the world, the Stanley Arthur World Museum. This museum was filled with rare artifacts from around the world and priceless gems. It was no wonder that every week a new psychopath would try to rob the place. On this particular night, it was a woman known only by her alias, the Vampire. She had gotten this alias from her first robbery, where she had stolen pints of blood from a clinic. After that, she had been able to rob multiple stores and homes. Some citizens thought that she was an actual vampire by the way she would get in and out of the places she was robbing with high speeds that could be described as superhuman. It was all just stories. She was probably just a really quick and agile woman, probably being the operative world. Long story short, the vampire stole a very important artifact that was located in a secret wing of the museum. This artifact would take Nicole on a journey of self-reflection. The next morning, Nicole woke up much earlier than usual, and she could hear voices coming from down the stairs. One of the voices was her grandmother. Nicole decided to make her way down the stairs to see what all the commotion was about. She found her grandmother arguing with a woman and a man who was dressed in museum attire. She recognized the attire because that is where her father had worked before he died. She made her presence known. The museum staff looked at her with a look of concern. Nicole asked what was going on. There was a reluctance on their part, but they eventually had let her know what had happened. They were informed about the artifact that was stolen at the museum. This particular artifact had been found by Nicole's dad, Thomas Hadden, who was an archaeologist who worked very closely with the museum. Dr. Hadden had risked his life finding that artifact. This is why it had been hidden from the public. There was one more detail. The artifact was part of a set of 2. The part of the set had been kept by Hadden. The staff was here to find out if the other part of the artifact had also been stolen from the house. They had already been assured that it had not been stolen. Nicole's grandmother then led the two employees out the door and locked up after them. She then turned to Nicole with a look of concern. Nicole, recognizing the look, walked off up the stairs and ignored her grandmother. Elaine shouted up the stairs at Nicole to come down. Nicole got into her room and shut the door behind her. She then quickly got ready for school. Elaine paced downstairs. She wanted to find a way to talk to Nicole. Suddenly, there was a flash of light that zoomed past her. Elaine made her way to the couch and sat down. She took a deep sigh as she put her head in her hands. Nicole made her way to school, but this time everything was moving in real time. She was not late for school at all. She just needed to get out of the house as soon as she could. She had to get away from the storm that had begun because of that artifact. She knew the importance of it. She knew what was to come if that artifact was in the wrong hands. She did not want to deal with it at the moment. All she cared about was getting to school. That was it for her. Getting to school. There was no boy, no activity, no big test that she was worried about. All she wanted was to be at school, away from home. At school, she felt safe. Not safe in a physical sense. There was no danger at home. Her home was very chilled and warm. It was just that home came with expectations and bad memories of things that had happened. Memories of someone she was sure she wasn't. There was no denying that her life had become more stagnant and needless. She had become a young woman who just lived to go from point A to B. Nicole spent the whole day at school forgetting everything that had happened in the morning. After school, she walked out of the building and made her way home. As she walked home from school, she could see a car following her slowly. It was a black, sleek sports car with green accents. She knew she was being followed, but she didn't know by who. She had a vague idea who it could be. She smiled and closed her eyes. She opened them, and they were glowing. Everything around her stopped. She walked back towards the car that was now still too, like everything else around her. She crouched down to stare into the tinted windows. The window on the passenger side was slightly opened. She looked through and saw the driver staring right at her. He was wearing jet black sunglasses. He had a scruffy beard and scruffy, ungroomed hair. He was muscular but slim and had a tight, long-sleeve black t-shirt on. She knew exactly who it was. She sighed in annoyance as she opened the door and got into the car. Her eyes stopped glowing as everything started moving again. She turned to the man and asked him if Elaine had sent him. He snickered and nodded in agreement. Nicole then folded her arms as she looked forward, ignoring her companion. She referred to him as Scott. Scott then asked her why she was avoiding the robbery. She ignored him. He stopped the car, then took off his glasses. He stared into her eyes. She continued to ignore him. He then asked her how long she would crucify herself for an undisclosed event. She gave him a death stare. Scott put his hands up as he knew he had crossed a line. He told her that the next person who would come to see her would not be a friendly face, and that she had to come to terms with her inner demons. Nicole's eyes glowed and she disappeared into the thin air. Scott smiled and drove off. Chapter 3. Nicole found herself in a field with no one in sight. All she could see were stars and the moon. She heard a voice whisper in Tagalog, "Hanggang sa makita ulit tayo," which means "until we meet again." The voice was familiar, but she had no idea who it was. Nicole then saw a dark hooded figure in the distance with lightning emanating from his body. She knew who it was. Suddenly, Nicole awakened from her nightmare. Her blanket was hot and had begun to burn slightly. The stars outside seemed to be brighter than usual, but they began to go back to their usual brightness. Nicole made her way down the stairs for a glass of water. As she was drinking, she was disturbed by the vision she had seen in her dreams. She could also only think of the artifact that had been stolen. As she walked out of the house, she locked the door behind her. She made her way to the back of the house where she opened a small door that led to the basement. She walked through to the basement where she switched the light on. She then made her way to a trunk that was covered by a cloth. She removed the cloth and looked at the trunk that was heavily locked. She sat down next to the trunk and put her hand on top of it. She laid her head on top of it and slowly drifted off to sleep. The next morning, she was awakened by her grandmother, who was holding a cup of tea, which she handed to Nicole. Nicole smiled and slowly stood up. She took the cup and began to take sips of the tea. Nicole looked at the trunk and walked towards the basement door. Elaine looked at the trunk and covered it up again. She then told Nicole that she would be late for school. She caught a flash of light behind her, and she looked behind her. Nicole was gone. Elaine smiled and made her way back into the house. At school, Nicole thought about the robbery a lot. She was distracted by it the whole day. After school, instead of going home, she decided to take a bus to the museum. Nicole and Elaine had lifetime access to the museum and all of its wings. This meant she could go in and out whenever she wanted to. She made her way into the museum and walked around. She went through all the exhibits and examined all of them. It had been a long time since she had been here. It was like she was taking a tour of an old home. In some ways, she was. She had been here 1,000 times as a kid. Thomas would always bring her here after school and go through the whole museum, and he would tell her stories about all the artifacts and exhibits. He was like a wizard with his words, and he seemed to always know everything about the museum. The fond memory started to flood her mind as she made her way through the building. She also started to tear up. She wiped the tears away and headed to the back of the building where the staff was. The staff let her in. Even though she hadn't been there since her father died, they let her in with open arms. She then asked about the robbery. The staff was reluctant to let her know the details of what happened. So, they took her to the scene of the robbery where the artifact had been stolen. She knelt in front of the empty display and looked at it a few times. After she was done, she headed back home. She spent her afternoon doing her homework and thinking about the robbery. She wondered how the vampire had gotten into the secret wing of the museum undetected. That night, she spent the whole night researching robberies by the vampire. After seeing some of the details of these robberies, she was convinced that this mysterious human was a vampire. It wasn't crazy. She had seen much crazier and creepier things, such as herself. The night had been quiet and still for the most part. She heard a sound come from the kitchen. She blew it off as she continued her research. She then heard another sound making its way up the stairs. She slowly got up and tiptoed to the door of her bedroom. She slowly opened up and saw nothing. She walked towards the steps to further examine the sound she had heard. She saw nothing out of the ordinary. She walked to her grandmother's room and knocked on her door. Elaine did not answer, but Nicole could hear her grandmother snore. Nicole smiled and headed to her bedroom where she closed her door. When Nicole turned around, she saw a hooded figure at her window. She slightly panicked and asked the figure what it wanted. A woman's voice came from the figure. It asked her where the staff was. As soon as the figure asked that, Nicole knew she was in the presence of the vampire. Nicole screamed for her to stand down. The vampire just stood there quietly. Nicole reached for the door. Suddenly, the vampire lunged at her with speed. Nicole's eyes started to glow as everything stood still. She then looked at the vampire's face. The vampire had pale white skin, and believe it or not, long fangs. Nicole smiled, but she realized that the vampire was slowly moving towards her. She was shocked. There was no way that anyone, or in this case, any creature, could move fast enough to catch up with her. Nicole quickly raised her hand that started to glow. She then punched the almost still figure. Everything started to move again, and the vampire was on the floor, grasping at her face in pain. Nicole grabbed the vampire and disappeared out of her room. She took the vampire to a nearby police station and just dumped her there. Nicole then ran back to her room. She cleaned up and went straight into her blanket. As she looked out the window, a slight smile filled her face. She felt a feeling she thought she had lost a long time ago.